You like them?
Well, good morning and happy Hanukkah. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for Shabbos morning. And I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning by my dear friend, Rabbi Marc Gellman. I'm in California. Rabbi Marc is in Florida. We're the only two parts of the country that are not under 10 feet of snow and 5 degrees below zero. And to prove that, we sent Rabbi Sherry out to go surfing today. So we wish her a very wonderful surfing Shabbos. Anyway, it's good to have you, Marc. I hope you're doing well. Shabbat Shalom.
Good. Love you. Happy Hanukkah.
Well, happy Hanukkah. Let's for a moment, we talked about Hanukkah at length last week, of course. Let's for a moment turn our attention not to Hanukkah, but to the other holiday that's being celebrated around us. Of course, all around us this week, our Christian friends are celebrating Christmas, right? And Christmas families are gathering together to exchange presents. Some will be going to church to pray. Others will be having large dinners. Everyone's watching out for Santa Claus. So for just a moment, Marc, we want to show deep respect to our Christian friends and neighbors, but this is the only time of year that as a Jewish kid, I felt pushed to the periphery. It was the only time of year that I felt excluded. It was the only time of the year that I became acutely aware that I am different than the world about me. I remember in elementary school, we used to have the Christmas program. We'd sing 22 Christmas songs, and I had a little dreidel for the two of us who were Jewish in the class.
It's pathetic. Right? We got nothing to go up against any of it.
Yep.
And half of their best songs were written by Jews.
Well, that's also the truth. But for just a moment, let's take this with some seriousness.
Yeah.
How does a believing Jew, a loyal, committed Jew, look out at the culture outside? How do you take in this Christmas season? Is it appropriate to join the celebration? Is it appropriate to sing the songs and enjoy the spirit? Or do I have to push it away in order to establish my identity and to protect my children from assimilating into this? What do you think?
Yeah, the December dilemma is huge. And let's just add to that, it's a particular challenge for interfaith couples.
Yeah.
You have to navigate the Hanukkah Christmas conflict every December. And for me, my friendship with Tom Hartman didn't begin, but it was the flourishing of my move to appreciate Christmas as an outsider. Our dear friend Richie Siegel, may his memory be blessed, Richie wrote a book, How to Be a Perfect Stranger, which is a great title. And it was about how do you approach the other holidays of other religions that are not yours. And I think we have to begin by looking at what we expect of them, and then put it onto what they might expect from us. At the Passover Seder, you and I know, we all know, that we're encouraged to invite non-Jews to participate in our Seder, to learn and to be welcome guests in the Seder because of our teaching and our belief that those who left Egypt were an Erev Rav, a mixed multitude. It wasn't just Jews who left Egypt, it was Egyptians who were tired of being slaves. They came with us. And they are honored participants in the miracle of Passover freedom. So we open our doors to them and expect them to be involved in our holiday of Passover and their great holiday of Christmas. What can they expect from us? Now, my favorite example of respectful Jewish appreciation of Christmas is the history of many communities, particularly small communities, where Jews would take on the jobs of Christians on Christmas Day so that their Christian friends could have the day off and be with their families. That's a wonderful practice and an inspiring one, that Jews would volunteer. I know when my brother was doing his residency and rotations as a physician and a surgeon, they would cover for their Christian friends on Christmas. So that's one thing. The other thing is to realize that not appreciating certain elements of Christmas, and I'll explain what those elements are in a second, but not appreciating anything about Christmas hardens our own souls. If you can't get joy at listening to some of the Christmas music, your soul is just frozen. And the only good thing in your life are Jewish things, which is only partially good. It's not a good thing to have all the things in your life that are good be Jewish. It's good that all the Jewish things are good, but there's some wonderful music. And if you can't listen to Handel's Messiah and get involved in the final chorus, it's just really, it doesn't speak well of your spiritual generosity. That's the first thing. The second is, there's no reason why you can't be what Richie called a perfect stranger. When I was growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I definitely had the feelings you had, Eddie, but multiplied 1,000-fold in the Midwest, because Milwaukee had maybe 1.5 million population, and there were, I don't know, 20,000 Jews. So we were a little community, but not insubstantial. But still, on Christmas, and it was at the time when the only thing we had were radios. So whatever channel you turned to, it was Christmas music. Yeah. And there's no place you could go because everything was closed. And that's where the old joke about Jews eating Chinese food on Christmas came. But I would go next door to my neighbor, Dick Albrecht, and I would help him decorate his Christmas tree. Mm-hmm. And I loved doing that. And I never made the move from, this is a beautiful thing, this Christmas tree, and it had in the old days those colored fluid, this colored water with bubbles that would go up the little ornaments. It was beautiful. So, but there's no necessity that enjoying something about your neighbor's holidays sucks you in and causes you to spit on your own holidays. That's just not true. I enjoyed his celebration of his Christmas. The other thing is that, unlike Easter, where I do think that there is a very, very strong barrier to the appreciation of Easter by Jews, not only because of its message that of the atoning death of Jesus that we have nothing in our tradition that supports, but also because it was very common in Eastern Europe that there were pogroms on Good Friday as the story of the Jews killing Jesus, the false story that Nostra Aetate thankfully put in the rearview mirror of Catholicism, that there's a barrier with Easter. But with Christmas, what you're talking about for Christians is hope, the hope of the birth of a Messiah and of a redemption. And we have that too. And so it comes down to this. They're celebrating and hoping for the return of a Messiah. We're celebrating and hoping for the arrival of a Messiah. Now, whether it's the return or the first visit, we'll be able to sort it out in the future. That's the way Tommy and I viewed it. Let's wait until the Messiah comes or returns, and we'll sort it all out then. And we had this joke, we'd say, and if it turns out that it's a return, there's going to be a lot of Jews who said, and for this I gave up lobsters, shrimp, and barbecued ribs. No. And if it's the first time, there are going to be a lot of priests who say, and for this I gave up sex. Right. I mean, come on. So the truth of the matter is, we are united more closely in hope than we are in the issue of sacrificial atonement. Right. That's my thinking about Christmas.
Yeah, I remember my mom, especially, who was the sort of guardian of ethics in our home, who, made a very strong statement about our not participating in the Christian the Christmas celebrations and would resent any word of how, look how pretty the tree is, Mom, or this,
Yeah.
because mom represented, I think, a generation. She was her parents are immigrants, my grandparents are immigrants, a generation that was deeply insecure in America, and in some ways deeply insecure with her American Judaism. And in order to protect that Judaism from what she felt was the polluting effects of American assimilation, built a wall. And the wall said, you don't go near that. You don't go near that. Now, to a certain extent, a wall is necessary. In some ways, to go back to our previous conversation from last week, the wall is what Hanukkah was all about. How much can you participate in the outside culture without becoming them? But the question is, as we've become more secure in our Jewishness, as well as in our American identity, we don't feel like we have to build that wall around ourselves and, as it were, protect ourselves from the corrupting influences of an outside culture, but we can participate wisely and selectively in that outside culture. You can relax a little bit and go next door and enjoy decorating the tree, and then invite the kid next door to our house to eat latkes and play dreidel and light Hanukkah candles, which they really loved doing, by the way. They really loved coming over and eating latkes and playing dreidel and lighting candles and sharing our holiday. And that kind of sharing of both custom, and then begin to talk about what, as you said, so the ideas of these holidays is, I think, one of the great gifts of American democracy to Judaism. I mean, for so many generations, any kind of cultural sharing had to be done very surreptitiously. Maimonides, of course, took the Aristotelian philosophy of the Arab culture he lived in, but otherwise, there were walls built because we had to protect Judaism from the outside. America's given us the chance to talk to the outside world. I'm quite sure that someone's going to send me a very angry email after this episode telling me, I'm endorsing Christmas celebrations by Jews, and I'm not. But I think that participating, as you said, in the program, I think hope is one of the themes that we share. I think another one of the themes that we share, if you look at the Christmas story, well, first of all, there are midrashim that parallel the Christmas story, that tell us the story of Moses, the story of Abraham. But what I think is more significant is the idea that from the lowest comes the highest, that the Savior, as it were, is born in a manger. A manger is a feeding trough in a barn, because there was no room for the stranger, that he didn't come from the palace where the king lived. In fact, the king was quite scared of him. He came from the low classes of the society. He came from people that had lost all hope in any kind of redemption, either material or spiritual. And that's what God gave them at that moment, is that wonderful sense that out of that milieu can come hope, can come light, can come celebration.
And it's echoed in our tradition by the Messiah as a leper at the gates of Rome.
Yeah, or the one, he's healing the lepers. He's changing the bandage. Eliyahu is the one changing the bandages on the lepers. The idea that you begin with the lowest in a society.
Yeah.
And I think that's very, very important. And when you look outside, even today, you look at those who are, at the worst places in our society, they're the ones who need that hope the deepest. So we're going to wish all of our neighbors and friends a very Merry Christmas, a very happy holiday, and hope that this week brings a great deal of joy and hope to us all. Let's turn now to the Torah portion. Yeah. We are in the middle of a set of stories. It's actually a novella that occurs at the end of the book of Genesis about Joseph and his brothers. Joseph is, of course, the firstborn of Rachel. There are only two sons that are born of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. He is the 11th of the 12 sons born to Jacob. He's the favorite of Jacob, and he wears that favoritism literally on his sleeve in a coat of many colors, the Technicolor dream coat. The brothers capture him, throw him in a pit. There's a question about who sells him into Egyptian slavery, but that was the plan. And he ends up in Egypt. And the Joseph story is a parable about history. The Joseph story is a parable about the exigencies of history, because every time you think that you've reached the lowest point, it's actually the invitation to the next point. Joseph's brothers hate him, and you say, oh, that's terrible. And they say, no, that's actually turns out to be important because that's the dynamic of the story. They throw him into the pit, and you say, oh my God, that's horrible. He's there. No, he's going to get rescued and taken down into Egypt. He gets taken down into Egypt, and he gets sold into the house of Potiphar. Potiphar is a big muckaluk in Pharaoh's palace, and Joseph becomes his chief steward, his chief servant. You say, well, that's wonderful. No, that's going to be terrible, because Potiphar has this very seductive wife. She's the Mrs. Robinson of the Bible, and she tries to seduce the boy when the master of the house is out, and that's a terrible thing. You say, no, that's going to put him into prison. Prison's terrible. No, prison's wonderful, because prison is where he's going to meet the cupbearer and the baker of the Pharaoh, and they're going to pull him up. And every time you think that you've reached the bottom, it's only the invitation of coming back up again. And every time you think you've reached the top, there's going to be a crash. And it's a parable of history. And you understand that this parable was written by people who were living in exile, or at least it was put together by people living in Babylon and asking themselves, have we reached the bottom of history? Maybe there is a glimmer of redemption in this story. Maybe in this story of our exile, just like in the story of Joseph, there is a glimmer of redemption. Well, he ends up as the prime minister of Egypt. And today, the story of his prime minister becoming the prime minister is revealed to us, because Pharaoh is going to have these dreams. Pharaoh is going to have these wild, crazy dreams of cows and sheaves, and he's not going to know what to do about it. And they bring Joseph out of the pit because he is the dream interpreter. He's the dream man in Egypt. And the irony, of course, is that in ancient times, Egypt was considered the world capital of magic. And magicians are supposed to be able to read these things, but nobody can read it except Joseph. And Joseph offers a concise and a powerful interpretation of the dream. And more than that, he offers Pharaoh a policy. He shows Pharaoh what to do. So before we get to that policy, Marc, talk to us about dreams in the Bible. The Bible has a particular philosophy about dreams and what they reveal.
Yeah. Unlike angels, the proof of which sort of goes outside our rational mind. There's nothing that we can say, you see, that was an angel. We do believe in angels, even so, but dreams are different. Dreams are things that we all can connect to. All of us have had dreams. And dreams, because they live in that fuzzy territory between consciousness and deep sleep, dreams present us with not just a psychological problem, thank you, Dr. Freud, but they also present us with a theological problem. In the ancient world, it was universally believed that dreams were a communication from God. The gods in a polytheistic culture. The Egyptians have a famous book of the dead, a book of dreams, and it was really kind of funny. If you dreamt of a white bird, you look up white bird in the book, and it says this means this. And so they believed that you could interpret the will of God through dreams. And I mean, we live in a completely secular modern world, and yet one of the most popular columns is the astrology column. And I don't care who you are, when you're in a Chinese restaurant and you get the fortune cookie, everyone reads their fortune. Everybody opens it up and reads it, and there's a little shred of, well, maybe this is true. So there is an impulse that dreams address of our desire to know the will of God, which is really a desire to know the future. And it actually is a desire to control God, because once we know the will of God, we can pray, God, I had a dream, and please do what you said in my dream. The problem with dreams is that they're ambiguous. And that's why the prophecy of Moses, both in the Torah and ultimately in the great Maimonides, is lifted up above all others. It says, look, people can all connect to God through dreams and visions, but only Moses spoke to God face to face. So there is an awareness in the Torah that dreams are not reliable because they need interpreters. But talking to God face to face doesn't need an interpreter. God says, do this, do that, go back to Egypt. It's very clear what you're supposed to do. There's no ambiguity in it. And that's what made Moses's prophecy supreme. And it was essential that Moses's prophecy be supreme because the law that we follow is rooted in the authority of Moses. If there was some ambiguity in how Moses got the law, then we could say, well, he didn't sort of get this right. The rabbis get very close to that position in some of their midrashim, but that's the issue. We need to establish the authority of the law. And Moses is the way we do that, and the way we do it through Moses is by separating dreams as the source of communication from all other sources.
So I had a mentorship when I was at JTS, when I was in seminary, with a very interesting rabbi in New York named Rabbi Alan Miller of blessed memory. And
Sure.
Alan was the rabbi of the of SAJ, which is where I did my my internship, and I was working there as a teacher and was the high school director there. Alan, in addition to being a rabbi,
Society for the Advancement of Judaism.
right? Alan, in addition to being the rabbi, had a PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of London. So he had an exquisite sensitivity to myth and story. And then to make a living at all this, because you can't make a living in any of these things, he went off and became a classically trained psychoanalyst. He was a member of the Freudian Society, Psychoanalytic Society of New York, and would practice psychoanalysis in his rabbinic office half of the day and the rest of the time be a rabbi. So Alan's father was a very Orthodox rabbi. And we talked a lot about these issues. And because Freud was his prophet, he was, don't shake your head, actually, because this is what he said.
I'm shaking my head.
This is what he said. He said, look, he said, Ed, he had this wonderful British accent. He said, Ed, he said, my father believed in the infinite mind of God. And when he read Torah, it was about interpreting the words of Torah to try to find the deepest meanings of those words that came from the infinite mind of God. And I believe, he said, I believe in the infinite mind of human beings. And when I read Torah, I'm looking for the infinite depth that comes from the depths of subconscious and unconscious that are deep within the human soul. He said, who's to say that the infinite mind of God and the infinite mind of man, the infinite mind of human beings, don't meet at some point? So the dream, to read a dream is to read something very deep about ourselves. And if you imagine that we ourselves are somehow connected to something bigger, it's actually to read something about the universe. At least it's something very deep within ourselves. It's not a superficial thing of, you saw something in the dream and that reveals your sexual desires, as Freud would say, or your fears or something, but something important in the structure of who you are and what you are as a human being.
I believe all that, but it doesn't tell you anything about God. That's the point.
Well, it does tell you something
about you.
That's
but
true.
It doesn't tell you something about God.
Except if you believe.
You need reason. You need reason. Maimonides.
No, I'm not taking reason out of the thing, but we've all had a dream or two in our life that's you woke up and you said, whoa, or when you started to think about that dream, or even a daydream. When you started to think about it, you began to discover something about where you fit in the world, how you see the world, how you construct the world. Here in the Torah.
To me, dreams are the way that our fears claim us again. Our repressed fears claim us.
Okay.
When you dream, you have no resistance to your fears. So they just come flooding back. And I sort of think of it in a computer way where, sometimes your computer just has to reboot because it's filled with all these bugs and stuff. And you just have to turn it off and turn it on again and wipe out the old stuff. And every night we're given this physical urge to sleep, which allow us to reboot our minds. I can tell you this because I was approached once by the American Psychiatric Association to write a piece for their annual, a peer-reviewed piece on repentance as therapy in Jewish pastoral counseling. And of course, I knew psychiatrists also because any rabbi worth his or her salt has got to have a psychiatrist on hand for certain difficult congregants where you just don't want to mess things up. And you want to make sure that you refer them in the proper way and that you don't get sucked in by borderline personality types. It's very important. So in my contact with all these shrinks, I can tell you that the great transformation, post-Freudian transformation, is the near universal, it's not universal, but the near universal condemnation of the speaking cure, the psychoanalysis, and the triumph, the near universal triumph of psychiatrists as drug prescribers and manipulators of medications, psychotropic drugs. And so there has been, I think, a rejection, particularly in the field where dream interpretation began to have scientific credibility. There's been a rejection of that and an affirmation of more symptomatic relief through different kinds of drugs. And I think that's important to understand. We as theologians, as philosophers, we can't, I think, reasonably or helpfully pursue a course that even psychiatrists aren't willing to pursue anymore.
Yeah, I'm not advocating, dream interpretation as a new rabbinic technique. I'm not. But let's take this particular situation.
All right.
Egypt, the Middle East in general, has waves of drought and waves of flooding. Egypt in particular had waves of prosperity and waves of depression and recession, right? What Joseph tells Pharaoh is that's not the important part of what Joseph tells Pharaoh. To tell him that you're going to get 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of want. Everybody knew that you could have read on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. What he says next is what's interesting. He tells him what to do. More than telling him what to do, he tells him this is what government ought to do. Joseph's genius is not in the interpretation of the dream. Joseph's genius is that he empowers Pharaoh to do something about it. That we are not powerless in the face of these shifting economic fortunes. We're not powerless in the face of nature. We're not powerless to fight famine. Government has a power to do something on a grand scale, which can ameliorate this issue. And that's the genius of the thing, you see? Yes. The genius of the thing is once you've shown somebody, this is what the dream tells you you are. Now, what are you going to do about it? What's your next step? Who are you? Who do you want to become? Who could you become? The dream pushes you to imagine yourself becoming something you hadn't imagined before. And that's what I love about this story, is that Pharaoh depends upon him because he's saying to Pharaoh, you have something, you have a capacity to imagine yourself differently than you imagine yourself now. And dream as a function of imagination. That's why daydreams are kind of wonderful. They give us a capacity to imagine ourselves as a whole different character in the world.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. Your point is brilliant. It's right. It's true. This idea of doing something rather than just interpreting the dream in some abstract way, I think that enables you not to feel like a victim. But I would only add one thing, a sort of historical thing of why it was so hard for the Egyptians to see something which, as you say, was written on the front page of the Egyptian Wall Street Journal. And that is, Egypt never had droughts. And the reason Egypt never had droughts is because of the Nile River.
Right.
And the reason the Nile River was critical is that every year, through this great melting of the snows of Mount Kilimanjaro in southern Africa, down into the Nile River, which was so great, so important, it was just called Hanar, the river. It would flood out to about, a mile or two on either side of the banks, deposit rich, nitrogen-rich silt and organic materials, and then come back after the floods to its normal dimensions. And the Egyptians could farm on either side of the river forever with good soil. They didn't have to know about crop rotation. They didn't have to know about anything, and they didn't have to worry about rain because they had fresh water from the Nile River. And it also developed their talent for geometry and for irrigation. So there was this was the source of the greatest wealth of the greatest ancient empire.
Mm-hmm.
And they had deserts on both sides, so they were completely protected, just like America has oceans on two sides, and it's protected. So Egypt was unique, totally unique. It never was vulnerable to anything. It wasn't vulnerable to other nations, and it wasn't vulnerable to nature. So the dreams that Pharaoh had they went under the radar. And Joseph said, no, you're going to have a drought. And you better prepare. And the preparation enabled the Pharaoh to basically buy on the cheap all the land of Egypt so that he owned everything. And he was everything. And Joseph got rewarded because of that. And our people were saved.
Yes, except now they'll go one more step. Because remember, the whole purpose of the Joseph story is to tell you that history's highs are invitations to its lows.
There arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph.
No, but Joseph enslaves the people. And several generations later, they remember it and they return the favor, right? Joseph. So the political economy of Egypt was that Pharaoh owned everybody and everything. Everybody was a slave to Pharaoh, everybody. And everything was owned by the Pharaoh. And the Bible makes the point that Joseph is the one who engineered this situation. And then the question is, when you have a new Pharaoh and you look at yourself and the people see themselves as slaves to Pharaoh, and they say it's the Jews who did this to us, did that initiate the resentment that gives us the next chapter of the story? And that's what's the interesting question. Does that initiate the next chapter of the story? But in actuality, the next chapter of the story is the brothers are going to come down. And the brothers are going to come down. Joseph's brothers are going to come down to get food because there is famine in Canaan. And they're going to come down and they're going to stand in front of him. And they don't know it's Joseph. And he confronts his past. Now, remember, his past he always held his past with a certain quality of bitterness. He had two children, Manasseh, which means I forgot the bastards back home, and Ephraim, meaning I prospered here in this new land. And here, as it were, they come down. They come down and they stand in front of him. The guys who threw him in the pit, the guys who wanted him dead, the guys who sold him into slavery, which in so many ways is a fate worse than death for a young, pretty boy in the Middle East. The guys who did this to him and had no mercy and no compassion and no empathy and didn't care even about their father and his suffering, they come and they stand in front of him. And Joseph has to decide, what does he do with these guys? Does he turn his back and just forget them and say, Ephraim and Manasseh, I have forgotten what happened to me before, and I am prospering here in my new land? Does he do to them what they did to him? Does he throw them in the pit and enslave them and kill them? Or does he reconnect with them in some fashion? And that's the drama we're about to begin.
Exactly right. I think you're right. And there's two stories that are the engine of this great narrative. One is Joseph's decision to forgo revenge, which is a wonderful lesson, that there's a point at which you can let it go. First of all, he's had success. He understands that his life is a tool in the salvation of the Jewish people. He lets go of his anger. The second story is the redemption of Judah, that Judah steps forward when Joseph does the trick of putting his goblet in Benjamin's sack, and they said, accuses them of thievery. And Judah says, look, keep me as a slave, but don't blame them. And our father will come down and see him, and you'll see your brother. Because he wants to see if they killed Benjamin, because these were the two kids from the beloved wife, Rachel. So Judah gives up the hatred of his brother and his complicity in his sale as a slave, and says, take me as a slave. So everyone is getting redeemed by their action. And that's necessary because, as we've spoken of in our Torah discussions, this is the end of the Jewish family. And it is just on the cusp of the beginning of the Jewish people. And once we leave the Jewish family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the women behind, once we put that in our rear view theological mirrors, our next move is to see, how do we describe and how do we minister to, how do we lead the Jewish people? And that's the task that presents the hero of the Torah, Moses, to us in the beginning of the book of Exodus.
So I always like to ask myself, who told this story and why? Who told this story and why? So I can imagine, for example, a generation of Jews exiled from Jerusalem, living by the waters of Babylon, where they sat and they wept, and looking across the table at people that they can't stand. Because when the Babylonians took the Jews of Jerusalem into exile, they took everybody. They took the Republicans and the Democrats. They took the Likudniks and the Meretz guys. They took the Orthodox and the Reform and the Conservative. They took the Zionists and the anti-Zionist. They took everybody. The Babylonians didn't know the differences. They didn't know the differences. And here we sit in Babylon, just like we once stood in Egypt, brothers and sisters who hate each other, who have tried adamantly to kill each other. And the question is, can you look across the table now and forgive these people and let go of the grievance and the resentment and the bitterness and the contempt and the anger and make common cause because your survival depends upon it? Or are you going to keep fighting and destroy yourselves even now? And the story of the end of the book of Genesis is a story given to us by a very wise leader of that community that said, guys, it don't matter no more what happened before, because we're in a whole new world now. And now if we don't recognize what we have in common, we're going to lose it all over again. It's such an interesting story. And it's a story that sort of rings through Jewish history. Can you let go of your rivalries, your grievances, your bitterness, your anger? Everyone has a story of what you did to me yesterday. But if you don't let go of those stories, how can there ever be solidarity? How can there ever be peace? How can there ever be oneness? How do you get to that point? How do you get to that point when you're ready to say, all right, I'm ready to give up the resentment? That we're going to figure out next week when we open up Vayigash. So I want to wish everybody a really wonderful Shabbos.
Right.
To our Christian friends, a very, very sweet and happy Christmas holiday. And to everyone, a quiet national holiday. Even if it's not our holiday, the nice thing is that everything's quiet, everything's closed. It's a good time to take some time with your family. If you're not freezing cold, take a walk. Take a little time to enjoy family together. Stay warm. Marc, stay warm down there in Florida. Stay well.
God bless you. Good Shabbos.
Shabbat Shalom and a good Hanukkah to everyone.
Happy Hanukkah.